What's up, everyone? Welcome to Perpetually Patek, the forum for the discussion of all things Patek Philippe. Today, we're going to be talking about the Calatrava line of watches.
And this is, by most accounts, the 90th anniversary of the original reference that would come to be called part of the Calatrava series. And that was the 1932-96. Now, interesting on a couple of levels. First, Patek Philippe watch designed by the Stern family. The first to have a reference number. And a watch that was in production for 41 years from 1932, so very influential over time. Very simple. Bauhaus design, integrated lugs, simple indices, leaf hands, small seconds, and it survives today in the 5196, which I believe is lately departed.
Correct.
But now the 5196, it continued all of those trends in 2004 when it launched, and I think you could really call it the closest living descendant of that original. With the eclipse of the original 5196-96 design, where does that leave us today? Let's work backwards. Let's start from the Calatrava in 2022.
Just recently launched, you have the 5226G, which is a texture charcoal dial, 40 millimeter white gold watch. Very much, I would say, nouveau vintage. You've got syringe hands. You've got almost like a patinaed Arabic dial in hands. And I think that you just see the stark contrast of where the line is going, right? So you have this eclipse, as you mentioned, of a much more traditional in terms of appearance watch, being replaced by a watch that's much more modern and contemporary in appearance. And I do think the Calatrava represents almost the gateway to the rest of Patek Philippe, right? You still have the 5227, which is an officer-style case-back watch, a little bit more traditional, but again, a little bit bigger than what many were used to as far as the Calatrava goes. And you also had the reintroduction of the traditional hobnail Calatrava with the 6119, which was now a larger 39 millimeter size, a little bit more modern, I would say, in terms of appearance, also a brand new movement. So the watches as a whole have gotten larger, I would say younger, definitely a fresher take on the Calatrava. And then again, with the most recent novelty, I think you see it taking that casual dress watch approach, right? Like it's no longer your grandfather's 35 millimeter watch. These are now 39, 40 millimeter watches that are speaking to a more modern collector.
And we've seen a growing sophistication in the collection. There are still basically a few different types of Calatravas. You've got manual wind, you've got automatic, you've got small second, you've got center second, you've got dates, and you've got no dates. But if we look at the continuity in the modern era, we started with the 3520 in 1974, very basic, straight lugs, Piguet-based 177 manual wind caliber. We get the 3919 in 1985, which becomes the it dress watch in high horology in the 1980s, but still very compact, 33 millimeters, caliber 215 base, super simple. If you look at where we are now with the 6119, it's a huge step even over the 5119 that came out back in 2006. We now have a huge expansive display case back. We have an all-new movement in the 3255. Big, broad bridges, two mainspring barrels, hacking seconds, and a fairly bold dial with that vertical steel-like satination. This is a much more progressive watch. It's larger, yes, but it's also more deluxe in every way.
Deluxe is a good word, right? Because I do think that you have this element now moving across the entire Calatrava line. They're a lot richer in terms of feel and appearance. I think that it's more representative of the value now on the wrist. But you do also see an increase in the price point, right? You know, when the 3919 launched, it was just under $5,000. And now if you're entering into the Calatrava line, you're starting at around $30,000. So you really are getting a lot more watch, even though the price point has gone up.
And I think it's also important to remember that the automatic winding Calatravas are definitely more modern watches, but they're very important as well. 3 different threads of automatic Calatravas over the last couple of decades. We had the 5107, which became the 5127, which became the 5227. We also had the 5000 series that became the 6000 series that became the 6006. Talk a little bit about the 5107 and its progression to the 5227.
So I would say when the 5107 launched, it was still modern for what it was, right? It had the lug protectors, a slightly wider bezel, automatic movement with a date, and this was discontinued in favor of the 5127, which was slightly larger. The bezel had a slightly slimmer profile, and then altogether completely redesigned in favor of the 5227, which features an officer-style caseback. Perhaps a little bit more traditional, I think, in terms of appearance. And again, when the watch launched, that was much more in vogue. And I think that we see a stark contrast relative to the most recent launch, the 5226, in terms of where some of the aesthetics are going. But I think what's important to note is that the Calatrava line now is exceptionally diverse, right? You have a larger manual wind movement in the 6119, which is both modern and traditional at the same time. You have the 5227, which I would say is a step up in terms of the overall case construction, a little bit richer of a watch. And then you have the 5226, which is much more modern, much more contemporary, but all three still being in the Calatrava family.
Now, my favorite series of Calatravas has always been the one that started in 1992 with the 5000. So we got an unusual combination of automatic winding in a Calatrava and the 240 micro rotor. In general, when you see automatic Calatravas, it's going to be some sort of a center rotor automatic. Well, in 2005, that becomes the reference 6000. We get the same basic underlying running gear. We get a bigger case, no longer 33, now 37. The watch in white gold with a sunburst dial added a radial date indicator and, if I may, the aesthetic of an automotive dashboard, almost like a tachometer or, instead of a tachometer or a clock or a speedometer, something drawn straight from the 50s into a Patek Philippe dial. Now, in 2017, it got a little bit bigger yet again at 39 millimeters. Still not a big watch, but every series of this watch has had a striking radial numeral dial, a micro rotor automatic, and extremely strong lugs, which is what we saw right up to the end. The 6006 G is a monstrously tough-looking watch. It's not big, but strength of lugs has been a continuing theme among the Calatravas. Another good example, we were talking about the 5227. Doesn't have quite the crown guard profile of the 5107 or the 5127. It is a bigger watch, but somehow it looks less forceful without the crown guard structure. You're talking about how it's a little bit more of a modern watch, and I definitely see that. It isn't trying to look butch, bolstered, oversized for its size, the way the earlier watches were, but I think it's important to note that the lugs are just as strong. If you're talking about the strength of lugs on Calatravas, that's another great case study. And, to be perfectly frank, the 5296 that came out back in 2005, that also has strong lugs. Where does that one sit, especially the sector dial in modern Calatrava canon?
I guess rewinding back to the 6006
Yes.
And the 6000 series as a whole, to me, this was Patek Philippe trying to bring a younger customer into the Calatrava line. And you saw a non-traditional aesthetic, a non-traditional displaying of the time, and it was almost like a little bit too soon, right? The collectors of that time still trended to be a little bit older. They still wanted something that was a little bit more traditional. And so you saw more success with the 5296 without the sector dial. And again, first launch with the sector dial and then transitioning to the removal of it, I saw again this idea that they wanted to bring a younger customer into the watch, make it a little bit more casual, but you still had this lean to the traditional, and now it's the inverse, right? I think that the sector dial would be a lot more popular today, let's say. And even the 6000 and the 6006, if launched right now, like if instead of the 5212, the weekly calendar, they had done a 40 millimeter steel watch with the movement and dial configuration of the 6000 or 6006, I think it would be insanely and wildly popular and one of their most popular references within the complications line. So I think you see a trend that was started that really they hadn't seen the fruits of their labor yet until right now, and it's all blossoming well. But the 5296 as a whole, again, as far as the sector dial goes, just probably a little bit too soon.
Blending two of these threads, I talked about strength of lugs as a continuous feature in Calatrava design. You talked about a focus on a younger customer. They both come together in the reference 6007A, which was a limited edition piece dedicated to the opening of the new Patek Philippe manufacturer. That watch has lugs that are as strong as any sports watch, a stainless steel case, and in the array of radial numerals on the slate blue dial, it does have a little bit of the look of the 6006G, both of case and of dial.
Correct. minus you have the textured stamping on the 6007. But again, I think that the 6007 was very representative of taking a Calatrava and making it a little bit more sporty and more contemporary, and more close to a sport watch than a dress watch.
And I think Patek has done a really good job of maintaining two different threads of Calatrava design. You have more traditional, more conservative, then you have some that are a little bit more progressive, a little bit more audacious. And you've got watches like the 6007 and the 6006G, and then you've also got watches like the 5196P, which is about as traditional as they come. But you've also got the 5153, which is an officer-style watch that came out in 2009, and I can't think of a much more self-consciously antique wristwatch design in the business today, but it works.
If you look at that watch relative to, let's say, a 5227, both watches you were getting an officer-style case. On that watch, though, you were getting a deployment buckle. On the 5227, you're getting a tang. So in the case of the 5153, it actually represents what I thought was some of the best value as far as the Calatrava line went, because it coexisted with the 5227, except while both had an officer-style case, the 5153 had a deployment buckle, the 5227 had a tang, but the 5153 had a guilloche center. And this particular craft is generally reserved for a higher complication and more expensive watch. It also means that the dial itself could only be produced in a far more limited capacity. So you had a lot more going in with that watch than met the eye. And for that reason, I actually think that even though it's no longer being produced today, actually represents a really good value to be picked up in the secondhand.
And it's a great example of how Patek can take the Calatrava line and expand it to satisfy both the older, more traditional client and the younger one, because the 5153 and, of course, the 5227 are both caliber 324 automatic center rotor powered. They're both Hunter casebacks, and they could not be more different in how they look.
The Calatrava line as a whole, I think right now exists, is the most diverse that it's ever been. And what's interesting is that by getting rid of the 5196, you now have a whole category of watch that I do think that they're going to fill with something else, but it represents a category that I think you're going to see continue to grow and evolve and become more broad, because it truly is the gateway into the rest of the collection. And it's funny because what should really be the easiest watches to acquire, which, let's say, a time-only Calatrava, are some of the most difficult, along with a time-only Nautilus or time-only Aquanaut.